Haven, a bishop/special crimes unit novel by Kay Hooper. Prologue. In the first few minutes of Catherine Talbert's escape, she did her very best to be as quiet as possible. She thought he was gone, but she wasn't at all certain of that, and in her terror she just wanted to run. But she crept instead out into the darkness, not daring to take the time even to look for something to cover her naked body. If there was a moon, it was hidden behind a heavy cloud cover. Either way, Catherine had no idea where she was. Strain her eyes though she did, she couldn't see any sort of artificial light anywhere that might have meant a house nearby. Stupid, of course there's no house nearby. Someone would have heard you screaming. Surely someone would have. She was dizzy, faint with hunger and exhaustion, and sore to the bone, with bruises and internal injuries from the beatings, but all she felt was the desperate drive to escape. She chose a direction at random and struck out from her prison, moving as quickly as she could manage and still remain quiet. With no road to be seen, or more accurately, felt beneath her bare feet, she just made her way toward the deeper darkness of the looming woods, instinctively seeking the closest cover in which to hide herself from him. There was a shallow stream she splashed through as quietly as she could, beyond worrying about snakes or mud or anything else the girly girl she used to be would have concerned herself with. She wanted to live, that was all. She just wanted to live. Past the stream, the terrain changed, and she realized she was working her way up into the mountains. Mountains that had seemed so pretty to her when she had come to admire them. But now her bare feet were bruised and scraped by the granite jutting up unexpectedly here and there, and rough roots exposed by the heavy spring rains weeks before caused her to trip and stagger. Sometimes she fell, but she kept getting back up. Branches tugged at her as the undergrowth resisted her efforts to move through it, and she was vaguely aware that fresh wounds were being added to the cuts and bruises her body already bore. The night was almost unbearably still and quiet, but not the slightest breeze to relieve the oppressive heat. With not the slightest breeze to relieve the oppressive heat, and all Catherine could hear for what seemed a long time was her panting breaths. Then a brittle fallen branch cracked loudly beneath her foot. Panic rushed through her in a surge of adrenaline, and she threw caution to the wind. He might not have left. He might be right behind me. And this is his place, his home. He knows it, I'm sure. Oh, gosh. Faster. She had to move faster, as fast as she could, as far as she could. Her eyes had adjusted to the darkness just enough that she was able to keep from running headlong into a tree. But otherwise, all she really saw were varying shades of black. Still, she climbed as fast as she possibly could, grabbing rough, knobby branches and leafy bushes and stinging brambles to help herself along, at first not even feeling the slashes of thorns or the raw friction of bark and spiky leaves sliding through her fingers. Her breathing came in sobbing gasps now, and her legs burned as she climbed and climbed and climbed. There was no path. There was just an unyielding, steep incline, studded with granite boulders and towering trees, whose roots snaked out far and wide to anchor them to the mountain, and when she wasn't tripping over the roots, she was fighting her way through the thick underbrush. She reached the top of a ridge, clung dizzily to a sapling for a few moments, then pushed herself onward. Downhill should have been easier, but wasn't, because now she could feel the pain of her bruised and scraped feet, the hot pain all over that told her just how much the thorns and branches had torn at her naked flesh, and still she had to push on, through even more of the treacherous undergrowth. And now she had to fight to keep her balance, because there was the danger of falling and rolling, of losing her footing and not being able to catch herself. She lost track of time. She climbed to the top of one ridge only to stumble down with wavering balance and find another. Again and again. She thought hours had passed, must have. Her breath rasped and muscles burned. Gradually, the adrenaline of her escape wore off and exhaustion pulled at her. She staggered, weaving left and right, falling down, getting up, climbing. Always climbing, maybe to the top of the mountain. She didn't know anything except the drive to keep going. Her raw hands grasped whatever might help her to climb, whatever might help keep her on her feet. But more and more often when she did go down, she stayed there for a while. Resting, she told herself. She breathed in the musty smell of the earth, her scraped cheek pillowed only by broken branches, rotting leaves, and sometimes granite. She was so tired she didn't really care. She might have dozed now and then before picking herself up and going on. It occurred to her finally that her escape might well leave her lost in these woods forever, lost and unable to find help. That realization drove her to her feet again, and she grimly pulled herself up. Hours, which meant the sun would be up soon, and surely she could find help once there was light. Surely. Because she wanted to live, to survive this and remake what had been a fairly useless life so far. A careless and unthinking life. She wanted more now. She wanted to have a family, have children, and grow old, and forget about horrible darkness, and agony, and terror, and the faces of unspeakable evil. She wanted to live. She was working her way up yet another slope, squinting because she fancied she could see a lightening of the darkness, and the undergrowth seemed to be thinning out. One step at a time, pulling herself with numb hands and leaden arms, she climbed. She thought she was near the top of the ridge and told herself she would rest there, maybe sit for a while and wait for the sun to rise and tell her that, despite everything, she was going to live to see another day. It caught her unawares even so. She pulled herself on, and a pale orange beam of light struck her in the face, blinding her. It was warm and so bright after the darkness of hours, the darkness of days. It was wonderful. She wanted to come fully into the light, to bathe herself in it. She wanted to feel warm again. If anything, she pushed herself harder, grasping another sapling to drive herself on into the light. But this time the tree was stiff and snapped forward with more force than she'd expected, propelling her, almost launching her. And her numb feet gave her no warning that this time a sharp granite edge meant more than the top of another ridge. It was a cliff. She didn't even have a chance to catch her balance, a chance to save herself. Catherine Talbert left the ground and flew, aware of a sensation of absolute, glorious freedom, and for an instant she almost believed it would be possible to land safely. For an instant, just that. She fell, bathed in the light of dawn, making no sound because her terror of him was stronger than anything else still. Her last thought was that even this was better than what she had escaped from. Catherine Talbert was 21 years old. Chapter 1, Barren Hollow, June 22nd. Emma Rayburn shot bolt upright in bed, at first conscious of nothing except her heart pounding and the suffocating sense of being unable to breathe. Then she sucked in a gasp and slumped, her gaze darting around the room. Her bedroom, lit only by the pale light of dawn. Not a dark forest, not running in pain and terror, not a soaring end off the edge of a cliff. Emma heard a soft whine and leaned forward to pet the dog lying on the foot of her bed. "It's okay, girl," she murmured. "Just a dream, just another bad dream." Her heartbeat was returning to normal, but the oppressive weight of dread she felt had hardly diminished at all. She looked at the clock on her nightstand, saw that her alarm would be going off in another hour anyway, and tossed back the covers to get out of bed. She went to her dressing table across the room and turned on one of the small lamps. With cold hands she removed a journal from the top drawer and looked through several pages before turning to a fresh page and reaching for a pen to make a simple entry. June 22nd. Another nightmare in the woods this time. Different. She was running, trying to escape, but the same ending, always the same ending. Another dead girl. Emma stared at the entry for a long time and slowly looked back through the earlier entries. They went back nearly 2 years, with casual entries of a day lived in uninteresting habit interspersed with start dates and brief descriptions noting a nightmare of death. The death of a girl or a woman she never recognized, virtually all of them taking place in a dark, featureless room. Not a room she recognized, and yet she was absolutely certain it was somewhere in this area, in or near town, near home. She didn't know why she was so sure, but the knowledge was as absolute as the awareness of her own heart beating. In less than 2 years, she had dreamed of a dozen girls and women dying violently. Emma didn't need the first diary entry to tell her when the nightmares had begun. They had started after what had seemed a simple and fairly common accident. Her family home, now a well-respected and popular inn known as Rayburn House, offered its visitors various means of exploring the Appalachian Mountains surrounding this little valley where the small town of Barren Hollow was situated, and one of those means was guided trail riding on horseback. Emma didn't ride often, she seldom had the time, but that day she had decided on the spur of the moment to go along with the group from Rayburn House. The trail ride had gone fine, just the same as it always did, until... Afterward, she'd never been able to remember what had spooked her horse, but he had shied violently, catching her off guard, and Emma had fallen, which wouldn't have done much harm, probably, except that her head had struck a granite boulder. That casual decision to go riding had cost her more than a week in the town's small hospital and gave her an almost invisible scar above her right temple that was easily hidden by her dark hair. The doctors had been concerned because she had been unconscious for hours. They had worried about bleeding into the brain, they told her, but that hadn't happened. The injury, they told her, had merely bruised a section of her frontal lobe. Not like that had sounded scary or anything. Oh, no. The list of symptoms she'd been warned to watch out for had been sobering. Everything from difficulty concentrating or completing complex tasks she'd found easy to do before the accident, to changes in her personality or even loss of simple movement of body parts. Paralysis. None of that had happened, thank goodness, in the 2 years since the accident. Nothing had changed at all, except for the dreams, the nightmares. They're likely simple manifestations of the violence of your injury, Emma, that's all. Dr. Benfield had told her when she had finally found the nerve to ask him about it. It's not uncommon after a head injury to experience in some sense a reliving of the pain and fear. But it seems so real, she protested. I feel the terror, the pain, the panic. It doesn't just seem real, it is real, I know it. Because it's what you felt when you had the accident. Yeah, but I also feel them die. Have you talked to Chief Maitland? Are there missing women being reported, bodies being discovered, deaths corresponding with the nights when you dream? His tone had been professional, but she had fancied a note in there somewhere of a doctor humoring his patient. No, nothing like that, Emma had answered reluctantly. I mentioned it to Dan after that girl went missing last summer. Even checked on the internet and back issues of the newspaper at the library. And other than her, there really hasn't been anything in the county. No reports of other missing girls or women who didn't turn up later. Anyway, I don't think I dreamed about that particular girl. There was a picture supplied by her boyfriend for the search parties, and he thought that she just hiked out of the mountains in Colorado with someone after they argued. I heard later that was the case. Then your dreams aren't about real girls and women being horribly tortured and killed, right? Right. They'll probably go away on their own, Emma. But if they don't, or if you start having real trouble sleeping, let me know. There are meds that can help. That had been a few months before. When she had talked to Dr. Benfield, she hadn't returned, even though the dreams hadn't stopped. Emma stared down at the journal for a long time, then closed it, her hand absently smoothing the leather surface. She wasn't sure which frightened her more, the possibility that her nightmares were just her still injured brain on some kind of memory loop, replaying a potentially life-threatening accident again and again, but giving the women in that terrifying little play different faces and torments, or that there were warnings to her that awful things really were happening in this small, tight-knit town nestled in the mountains of western North Carolina. Bad things. things nobody else seemed to be aware of. Haven, June 25. I usually don't ask, John Garrett said to his wife, Maggie. Are you sure this is a good idea? I'm sure Jessie needs something we can't give her, and whatever it is interfering with her ability to work. Even her ability to live normally. The nightmares are hitting her harder each time. Probably worse because she can't remember them. They were standing what the resident operatives referred to as Command Central, a large open space at the center of the sprawling house. And one of the common areas open to all. Contained plenty of casual seating, numerous work tables and computer stations, and a huge rock fireplace surrounded by the sort of sofa you could curl up on for a discussion, to read a book, or just take an afternoon nap. There was an entire wall of reference books, and various cabinetry and furniture pieces hid office necessities such as printers, fax machines, and files. It was a workspace, yet it managed to feel comfortable and welcoming for all its clearly utilitarian purposes. This was Haven, a privately owned and run organization that provided trained operatives for various types of investigative work. Operatives who were also psychics. They worked sometimes in tandem with law enforcement and sometimes entirely on their own for clients. Haven was the name of the organization, and it was the name given by its operatives to this house and compound, which sat on a rather remote and highly secure 500-acre spread just outside Santa Fe, New Mexico. John and Maggie Garrett had founded and now operated Haven, and this was their home as well as their workspace, a home they shared with resident operatives who occupied their own suites of rooms here in the main house or in cottages that were part of the compound. For some, it was most certainly between assignments a family atmosphere, and even those not yet quite sure where they belonged admitted to feeling a comforting sense of community here at Haven. For most of them, it was the first time in their lives they weren't made to feel like freaks and were able to relax, living and working with others who also coped with both the highs and lows of being quote-unquote blessed with special abilities. At any given time, Haven could house as many as 24 of their operatives. At the moment, there were 12 longtime residents and 4 others spending a few months here in training. Jesse Rayburn was one of the longtime residents. Do you know what the nightmares are about? John asked his wife, whose psychic ability was an extraordinary empathy with the emotions of others and the unique ability to, in some cases, absorb and even heal their emotional and physical traumas. Maggie shook her head. Whatever the block is, it's solid, and I do mean solid. I can read more from her face about what she's feeling than anything empathically. She consented to having one of the telepaths try to get through again yesterday. He got nothing but a nosebleed for his trouble. John frowned. Maybe she didn't want him to get through. If so, either it's totally unconscious or else she's a hell of an actress because she fooled me. Maggie shook her head. Look, we knew from the beginning there was a trauma somewhere in her past, something buried deep. At first she was so shut down there was no sense even in trying to get at it. And she could function as a telepath and a medium, so there was time to let her settle in, find her footing, get used to the work. There was always a chance that would help. We both know it does sometimes. John rested a hip on the corner of a desk and watched his wife sit down in the chair. They were, in this rare moment, alone in the room. Well, you handle the operatives, but my impression was that you were being very careful with her in the work. Partnering her with operatives who had a lot more experience and who were a lot more grounded. With a slight grimace, her golden eyes amused, Maggie said, You noticed that, huh? Yeah, and I'm guessing she did too. Unfortunately. Jessie is stubborn and proud, and she doesn't like to feel she's being coddled or in any way treated differently from the other operatives. So she came to me a few weeks ago and said she wanted to break through whatever was causing her abilities to be increasingly erratic, causing the nightmares she could never remember. Wanted to or was ready to. John wasn't psychic himself, but he had worked with psychics long enough to understand them better than most. Wanted to. I'm not at all sure she was or is ready to subconsciously, but you tried and none of the usual tools worked. Maggie shook her head. Once you rule out hypnosis, there really aren't that many quick ways to get at something in the human mind when the mind resists. A cognitive interview didn't work because I didn't know where to start. Starting from when Jessie left Barren Hollow 15 years ago was useless. She only remembered getting in her car and leaving, with the overwhelming sense that she had to go as soon as possible. And, like I said, another telepath didn't work. None of the psychological tests have given us anything. Did you call Bishop? Unit Chief and Special Agent Noah Bishop was the third person responsible for the creation of Haven. His own Special Crimes Unit of the FBI was a team made up of psychics, and his idea was that such abilities could be useful as investigative tools, had proven over recent years to be successful beyond even his hopes. I did. And he was typically Bishop. He said Jessie would know if it was time to go back to the beginning, meaning back to Barren Hollow. Maggie nodded. Interestingly enough, Jessie walked in not 10 minutes later, asking if she could take her accumulated leave time and go back home for a visit. John sighed. So, did he just know she'd ask, or does he know what fate has in store for her there? One of Bishop's several psychic abilities was precognition. I don't know, Maggie paused and added, but she's packing to go back home, and even though I can't read her, I know damn well she's scared. I guess she wouldn't stand for it if we sent someone with her. It wasn't really a question. It was Maggie's turn to sigh. No, her guard's always up with a partner, and there's no good way for me to send another operative otherwise. John eyed his wife of several years. What is it you aren't telling me? It's just a bad feeling. Having learned through hard experience to respect his wife's emotions and intuitions, John's only question was about Jessie, about her going home. Maggie hesitated, frowning, then said, We have half a dozen operatives out in the field right now, and 3 here who are going through difficult times emotionally and psychically. Any of that could be responsible. I don't know what it is I'm picking up on, or who it's coming from. So maybe not Jessie and her demons. Maybe not. Then all you can do, her husband reminded her, is warn Jessie to be careful and to check in while she's gone. Yes, Maggie said, I just hope that's enough. Barren Hollow, June 27. This is such a bad idea. Jessie Rayburn pulled her car over to the side of the road and put it into park just at the top of the hill in front of the First Baptist Church. It was a spot always considered to be the start of downtown, a spot where most of downtown was visible. She rested her forearms on the steering wheel, gazing down on Main Street, Barren Hollow, North Carolina. Almost picture postcard perfect, a small town nestled in a valley of the Appalachian Mountains, a place where just about everybody knew everybody else, the locals at least. Tourists were another matter entirely, passing through pretty much year-round with their cameras and curiosity, leaving no mark of their visit behind. Jessie had done a quick web check before setting out, curious to find out if there had been any important changes in the town she'd left behind. With no major industry to support its workforce, Barren Hollow's economic strength was its beautiful scenery and the charm of a small town where numerous shops and galleries offered locally created art and textiles and crafts, much of it renowned through the southeast for its beauty and value, mountain craftsmanship. Well, all that and the reputed hauntings in various local areas since ghost, quote-unquote, hunting had become so very popular in recent years. Barren Hollow had a long history of violence and odd events despite its peaceful, pretty appearance, which made it a prime location for paranormal researchers, especially since so many of its buildings, commercial and residential, had been standing for a couple of centuries. Once the town had boasted giant textile mills and a paper mill out on the river, and even a few plastics plants, and nobody had cared very much about ghosts or old legends except to scare kids into behaving themselves. But the mills and plants had been dwindling even when Jessie had left. They were gone now, the paper mill abandoned and useless, and the textile mill buildings, quote-unquote, repurposed into pricey lofts or quaint art centers where visitors could watch sculptures and pots and rugs and jewelry being made. And any building or area that could claim even the hint of a ghost or some kind of paranormal energy had a sign out front now advertising the fact. There were even walking ghost tours. Still, the appearance of downtown Barren Hollow hadn't changed all that much, Jessie thought. Quite a few of the buildings appeared to have undergone facelifts of fresh paint or stucco or stone, and there were bright awnings and signs beckoning visitors, but otherwise it looked much the same, on the outside at least. Home. Well, once, not now. 15 years was a long time. A lifetime, really. She wasn't the 17-year-old girl who had fled Barren Hollow with all her worldly possessions stuffed in the trunk of her beat-up Mustang, a riot of wild emotions driving her, nothing in her mind except the need to escape. Get away. Run away. Escape something she couldn't remember except in fuzzy flashes that made no sense to her. Loud music, voices and laughter, the smell of whiskey, the smell of sweat, overwhelming shame, guilt, feeling of... And it was gone as quickly as that. Leaving behind it nothing except an urge to turn her car around and get as far away from this place as she possibly could. It was an urge she could fight now, but not one she could ignore, as she had ignored the fear behind it for so many years. She couldn't pretend whatever had happened was only a dream or a nightmare. She couldn't block it out. Not now, not anymore. 15 years of blocking it out had left problems and scars she had to face if she had any hope of moving on with the normal life. She wasn't even sure if she had consciously known then what she'd been running from, because all she clearly remembered was the need to escape, to run away. Damn, what the hell am I doing back here? Her own voice startled her, but the question didn't. She'd been asking herself that all during the drive east. It wasn't her inheritance. Emma could have that, and was welcome to it. Goodness knows she'd earned it, staying here. Jessie drew a breath and let it out slowly. Soon enough, they'd talk about all that if Emma wanted to talk. And that was a big if, since they hadn't been at all close as kids, and Emma had been only 15 when Jessie had left, without saying goodbye to anyone. But this whole trip was about closing the door on the past, letting go of baggage so Jessie could move on with her life, so she could sleep without nightmares and do her damn job. Whatever she had to do in order to accomplish that, she would do, had to do, because she was happy in her life now, in her job. It was work she loved and which had finally given her an identity and a place in the world she was proud of. That was worth risking a lot for. It was certainly worth risking a trip back to the town where she spent the first 17 years of her life. She pulled in a deep breath, then closed her eyes and let it out slowly, concentrating, doing her best to drop her guard so she could feel this place instead of just seeing it. But nothing, and she knew why. She didn't want to feel what she knew she would feel here, remember what she knew she had to remember, which meant she was buttoned up tight and sensing nothing, for now at least. She gazed down on the busy scene that was Barren Hollow on a Saturday morning and drew another breath in an attempt to steady her nerve. No choice now. She was here, and she'd driven a long way. And what was there to be afraid of after all? She was hardly that frightened, defenseless 17-year-old girl now. Far from it. Whatever had driven her away from this place, she was certain she could handle it now. Certain. She reached into her bag and found her cell phone, protected in its specially designed case from the sometimes erratic energy of a psychic. Not that Jessie had to worry about that at the moment, because she was all buttoned up. So tightly, in fact, that she was rather grimly certain she didn't even display an aura. She hit a speed dial button, and the call was almost immediately answered. There so soon? I didn't stop for much, Jessie told her boss. Maggie, are you sure this is necessary? Checking in shit? I'm not in a case after all, just a vacation. It's a little southern town with almost no crime rate. Hell, I don't think there's ever been a mugging in Barren Hollow. Ever. Humor me, okay? Just a quick call every day. Let me know you're alright. Going home is sometimes the hardest thing we ever have to do, especially when we're in search of memories. And you know me, I worry. Okay. Jessie thought of her nightmares, the one she could never remember, and her mind shied away. Determinedly keeping her voice light, she said, I'll call, I promise. That's all I ask. Jessie ended the call and dropped her phone back into her bag. She reached to put the car in gear, then froze, staring at her hand. For just an instant, so briefly she was almost certain she had imagined it, there had seemed to be the outline and faint color of a flower on the back of her hand. A rose. She stared at her hand, lifting it away from the gear shift to study what was now only smooth flesh. But she was sure she had seen something. Almost sure. A rose, she murmured, and she had no idea what that meant. Chapter 2. Jessie put the car back in gear and pulled away from the curb. It was only 2 short blocks to Rayburn House, built back in the days when this end of Main Street had boasted several large houses where the wealthy of Barren Hollow had lived. Now, of course, the remaining wealthy families wanted larger lots and quieter streets and built their mansions on mountain slopes to look down on the quaint little town. And what had once been large houses had mostly been turned into businesses of one kind or another, with a few divided into apartments or condos. Jessie turned her car into the driveway of what was now an inn rather than the family home, reflecting that if it had been Emma's idea to turn Rayburn House into a paying proposition, it had been a good one. Judging by the parking lot Jessie could see off to the side and nicely landscaped so it wasn't ugly, Rayburn House was doing good business, at least on this weekend. There was a rather unobtrusive sign that read valet parking, so she left the keys in the car when she got out. The long and wide front porch held several rocking chairs and small tables. One middle-aged couple was enjoying the summer morning with iced tea and a plate of cookies. They nodded politely to Jessie and said hi, and she returned the greeting, equally polite. It was warm, but not hot, so the big double doors were standing open, but the inn was protected from summer insects by a double screen door, decorative as well as practical. The screen door was opened for her by a middle-aged man, neat in jeans and a crisp white shirt with a name tag that read David. I'll bring in your luggage, ma'am, he said, courteous, and parked the car. Thank you. Even as she said it, Jessie reflected wryly that she had left her bag in the car, less because she'd expected someone to carry it for her, than because she was still fighting the urge to bolt. She could feel the pulse beating in her throat as she passed through the doorway and went into Rayburn House. Hi, welcome to approaching the registration desk, Jessie noted without surprise the other woman's surprise. Hi, she said simply, I'm Jessie Rayburn. The woman behind the desk was about Jessie's own age, brown-haired and brown-eyed, and pretty in a pleasantly unremarkable sort of way. But her smile was friendly and her voice was innately warm, which undoubtedly made her the perfect innkeeper. Yes, she cleared her throat and looked apologetic. I'm sorry, Miss Rayburn. I was just caught off guard by the resemblance. I mean, you're fair and Emma is dark, but otherwise... Night and day, Jessie said, keeping her voice light. People always said. I spoke to my sister a few days ago to let her know I was coming, so... Oh, of course, I'm Penny Willis, the innkeeper, and we were certainly expecting you. Your room is ready. David will take your luggage up as soon as he parks the car. Thanks. You're up on the family floor, of course, Penny said to Jessie in that warm, friendly tone. She came around the desk and led the way toward the stairs. I know Emma wanted to be here to meet you, but she's out right now. Every morning and afternoon she walks to the park with her dog. I'll call her Sal. No, don't disturb her. Jessie softened that with a faint smile. I'll take the chance to get settled in. We'll have plenty of time to talk later. She followed the innkeeper up the curving staircase, wondering just how significant it was that Emma wasn't here when she had known exactly when Jessie expected to arrive at Rayburn House. And Jessie was right on time. It hadn't occurred to him, when he'd first heard about it, that the homecoming of Jessie Rayburn would cause him any problems at all. Why should it? He'd been a clumsy brute back then, true enough, and things had not gone according to plan, but it was a long time ago, and besides, he'd taken care to make sure anything she did remember would be confused. Assuming she hadn't simply forgotten the whole thing completely, pushing it into the back of her consciousness where she wouldn't have to deal with it. It was a characteristic of hers, if he remembered correctly, ignore what she didn't want to face. Pretend it hadn't happened, and if that failed, run away from it, as she had several times run away from home as a child. She had definitely run away from something all those years ago. And if she had run because of what had happened at the party, if she was back now because she was beginning to remember, then she might just prove to be trouble after all. So, when he saw her arriving on Saturday, he quashed a reckless voice urging him to pay a casual visit to Rayburn House and say hello to her. No need to push his luck. If he encountered her casually during the 2 weeks or so she was supposed to be here, then so be it. But seeking her out struck him as a bad idea. For now, at least. Besides, he was a busy man. Emma Rayburn checked her watch for at least the third time, then threw the frisbee again for her eager Sheltie to race after. They had the small park to themselves, which was a bit unusual on a Saturday in June, but since the new children's interactive quote-unquote museum was opening downtown this weekend, Emma assumed most of the kids were there. Snacks, entertainment, lots of interesting stuff to look at and do. It was any mother's dream summer destination for kids out of school. The place was bound to be a hit. Emma should have been there herself, she knew, to show her support, both as a patron of the museum and as a community leader. Funny how that label had stuck to her. She wondered if Jessie would laugh. They hadn't been close even as kids, not the sort of sisters who shared confidences and borrowed each other's clothes. Emma had been the tomboy, the one always out on a horse, or hiking in the mountains, or playing sports at school. Jessie had been more of a girly girl, interested in clothes and makeup and hair, even before she hit her teens. Outgoing when part of a team, Emma had otherwise been a bit of a loner and casual about friends, letting none get too close. Raised to be self-reliant, her first impulse was never to confide in others or ask for help. Jessie, on the other hand, had worn her heart on her sleeve, impulsive and emotional. She had quote-unquote run away from home half a dozen times in childhood, and was always discovered hiking determinedly a mile or two from home, heading for anywhere but here. As a teenager, she had been flirty with more male friends than girlfriends, always dressing to draw attention and seemingly comfortable handling that attention. She and Emma had been very different in every way except their nearly identical faces set off by the night and day coloring. Emotionally, they might as well have been strangers or just teenagers who happened to live in the same house and saw each other only at meals, if then. Toward each other, they felt a kind of detachment that mirrored their father's temperament, so perhaps that had been why. Emma didn't know. Maybe that was it, that she and her sister had never been close, because their father had expected them to deal with their own problems, to rely on their own smarts and strength rather than look to others, even to each other. He'd always traveled for business, sometimes gone for weeks at a time, and, an unaffectionate man, had viewed his daughters with something closer to detachment than even mild interest. And since their mother had died when Emma was 8 and Jessie 10, that was all they had really known. Besides, it had been 15 years. People changed. Emma knew she assumed Jessie must have as well. So maybe Jessie wouldn't laugh. Maybe she wouldn't find it at all amusing that her younger sister had become a respected businesswoman in the community. maybe she wouldn't give a damn. Their phone conversation had been brief, and Emma hadn't been able to read much in her sister's calm, matter-of-fact tone. Jessie was coming home for a couple of weeks just to visit, just to see all the old familiar faces and places, that was all. She never had been a very good liar. Don't borrow trouble, wait and see what's on her mind. Good advice to herself, Emma reflected with a sigh. Until she knew just why Jessie had really come home, it was useless to speculate. She checked her watch again, threw the frisbee for a final time, and as soon as Lizzie came racing back with it, called the dog to heel. She met no one on the walk back home, which was probably just as well. It gave her time to practice her best pleasant, neutral expression, time to silently rehearse various things she wanted to say to Jessie, as if she hadn't been doing the very same thing during the scant 2 days since Jessie's call. Emma reached Rayburn House all too soon for her peace of mind, but was reasonably sure none of her misgivings showed in her face as she greeted a couple of guests out on the porch and then went inside. One glance at Penny's face told her that Jessie had arrived, so she merely said, "I lost track of time. Is she upstairs?" "Yeah, for at least 15 minutes. Said she'd unpack and settle in." Penny shook her head. "Wow, you two really do look alike. Dark and fair, but otherwise, night and day. We heard it since we were kids." So she said. She seemed very nice, pleasant. If there was a question in that, Emma chose to ignore it. "I'll go up," she said. "See you later." Okay. Emma climbed the stairs past the second-floor guest rooms and up to the third-floor family quote-unquote apartment. There was a broad, wide landing at the top of the stairs with several doors opening off it. One led up to the attic, used only for storage. One was for linens and other storage for this floor, and then double doors led into the family apartment. Beside the double doors was a discreet security keypad. Only Emma and Penny had the code. And now Jessie. Emma punched in the code and let herself and her dog into the apartment. It was a lot of space reserved for virtually no additional family members, and Emma had been toying with the idea of reconfiguring the space so that the inn could boast at least a couple of third-floor guest suites with very nice views of downtown and the mountains. Maybe next year. She hadn't decided. Her dog headed for the kitchen and her water dish, and Emma was left there hesitating for a moment. Her suite was off the right-hand hallway, and part of her wanted to retreat there, put off the meeting with her sister for another hour or two. Idiot, she won't bite you. Squaring her shoulders, Emma turned to the left and went down the hallway to Jessie's suite. She didn't let herself hesitate again, instead raising a hand to knock briskly, and then barely waiting for the invitation to enter before opening the door and walking into the sitting area. She left the door partially open behind her, knowing Lizzie would eventually come in search of her, but her gaze was fixed on the woman coming out of the bedroom to greet her. A woman now, not a girl. 15 years was, after all, a long time. But she would have recognized Jessie because that face and those eyes were very like her own, except that her sister was the fair one, night and day. "Hey, Emma." Jessie spoke as though those years had not passed, as though they had greeted each other only yesterday. "I like what you've done with the place." They'd never been a hugging sort of family. "Well, it's too big for just me to rattle around in," Emma heard herself respond just as casually. "This seemed the best idea." "Clearly. I hear the tourists have discovered Barren Hollow. And just in the nick of time. With the mills gone and other industries deserting us, the town was in danger of becoming one of those sad places with boarded-up buildings and no people." Jessie nodded slowly. "Good thing there are some artists and craftspeople to go with the nice scenery. And good that old ghost stories can finally be useful for something other than scaring the kids." She walked over to the very compact and efficient kitchenette along one wall and opened the fridge. "All stocked. You?" "Blunt," Emma said. "I didn't know if you'd want to be on your own or if you intended family time. Something like that." "I haven't been sure myself. Something to drink, Emma? I hear you've been to the park." I'll take a soda. Emma was in a strange way fascinated by the determined small talk. She took a few more steps into the room and sat down in one of the chairs flanking the sofa. Jessie joined her, choosing to sit on the end of the sofa nearest her sister's chair, and handed over a frosty plastic bottle. "I'm sure there are glasses, but I haven't explored yet," she said. "This is fine. No rings. I wonder if she ever married." "I never did," Jessie said. "You?" A breath escaped Emma, and she busied herself twisting the cap off her drink. "No." "So you can still do that?" I wondered. It was the only thing demonstrating a kind of closeness, a connection that the sisters had ever known, existing since their mother had died, and it was purely one way. Jessie had been able to read Emma's thoughts sometimes, but never the other way around. Rough on the sister who was more private. It had made both girls uneasy from the beginning, and it was something they had rarely ever mentioned. If anything, it had helped to drive an even deeper wedge between them. Jessie frowned. "I shouldn't have, actually. I've built walls, guards, and they're all up. Nobody else's thoughts have slipped through. I shouldn't have been able to read yours." "I guess some things don't change, no matter how hard we try to change them," Emma said. "I guess not," Jessie agreed, and her tone was grim. He was startled when he saw her walking downtown. Jessie Rayburn. Startled not because he hadn't known she was coming home for a visit, everyone knew that, but because in his mind she was still 17. She'd been thinner then, her fair hair longer, and she'd walk with more of a pseudo-sexy swagger than had been very much for show. Now she walked with the confidence he had a hunch was real and hard-won. Downtown was busy, so he didn't feel anybody would notice that he watched her for at least 2 blocks. He watched her because something about the searching way she was looking around, studying the buildings and the people she passed, caused a queasy unease to stir deep in his belly. It had been easy to forget what they'd done all those years ago. Well, maybe not easy, not at first, but eventually he'd be able to push it from his mind and keep it gone from his conscience, because there hadn't been any consequences after all, not even visible damage, to her at least, their victim. As for the consequences to him, they had been manageable, especially when he presented that none of it had been his fault anyway. And as the years passed, the memories had dimmed so much that he'd almost convinced himself it had been nothing more than a drunken dream. Nightmare. But here Jessie Rayburn was, home again, walking with her head up, her shoulders back, and her gaze searching. For what? For whom? For him? For them? His mouth was dry, and the queasiness in his stomach made it a sour dustiness. She could ruin him. She could destroy his life, even now. Even after all these years, she could punish him, them, because there was no statute of limitations on what they had done. She could destroy them all. Deciding on an exploring walk downtown, Jessie had left Emma back at Rayburn House, both of them still stiff and a bit too casual with each other, both aware of an underlying discomfort that was more than their 15 years apart. Jessie hadn't picked up any more of her sister's thoughts, but she wasn't certain whether that was because of Emma's walls or her own. Interesting if it was Emma. What Jessie knew now that she hadn't known as a kid was that the majority of people who had mental walls had built them consciously or subconsciously because of psychic ability, active or latent. Was Emma psychic after all? Jessie would have said not, had said not, as a matter of fact. Part of her wanted to ask, part of her didn't. In any case, all she knew now was that there were too many unspoken things between them, too many years and too much differing life experience that separated them, and neither sister was willing to open that door. Not yet, at least. Maybe not ever. What if I'm putting us both through this for nothing? The thought of returning to Haven no better off than when she left was depressing. Damn depressing. Maggie had reminded her that she'd need to open herself up once she was here, and that was the one thing she'd resisted. She was still buttoned up tight. Jessie's head told her that this was only her first day, after all, and that she had at least 10 days, maybe 2 weeks, if she stayed as long as she'd planned. So there was time, surely. Time to let herself settle in, to talk to Emma, assuming she could. Time to feel more comfortable here before she allowed her walls to drop and her other senses to probe, so that she could finally understand and face the truth of what had happened to her here all those years ago. There was time. No, there isn't. Jessie had been strolling past an interesting break between the buildings downtown, wider than an alley, that had been turned rather creatively into a park-like or picnic-like space, with greenery and flowers and little seating areas, both chairs with small tables and larger picnic tables. She stopped dead in her tracks and looked at the young woman standing near a stone bench, maybe a dozen feet away from her. A young woman wearing winter clothing and a sad, anxious expression. A young woman Jessie could faintly see through. A spirit. A spirit she could see with greater clarity than she'd ever been able to see one before. With all her walls up, without even trying to see the dead, without even reaching out or opening a door, the dead had come to her. Jessie glanced around quickly, saw no one else near, and took several steps toward the spirit. I shouldn't be able to see you, she said, low and fierce. You see me because you have to, because you're here, and you're the only one who can see. It's bigger than you and your memories, what's happened here. However it started, it's so much bigger now. Bigger than your pain and your shame and your guilt. You have to help me. You have to help us. You have to stop him before he goes on killing. You're sure? Maggie Garrett asked calmly. Oh, yeah. Jessie struggled to keep her own voice steady. A young woman, dressed for winter, in clothes about a decade out of date. Sad face, almost transparent. Creepy stuff to say. Definitely a spirit. And I wasn't looking for one. At all. Jessie had walked back to Rayburn House and managed to make it up to her room without encountering anyone who wanted to talk to her, which was a good thing, since she felt jumpy as hell and doubted she was hiding it. She'd always envied Emma her outward serenity. Do you believe the spirit is connected to why you went home, why you needed to? I don't know. I don't see how, but since I don't really remember what happened, except in flashes that make no sense to me, I can't be sure of anything. All I can tell you is that she asked me to stop a killer, and I gather whoever she was referring to has killed more than once. She kept her voice low, more out of habit than because she had any expectation of being overheard. But there's no evidence of a serial killer operating in Barren Hollow. I got on my laptop as soon as I returned here and checked the Haven and SCU databases. There's nothing about an active serial in this area, not even the suspicion of one. I also went online and checked the local newspaper archives, but they're still working on getting most of the back issues digitized. For that older stuff, I'll have to physically go to the library. Online, I could only go back a year or so. And people go missing around here all the time. I mean, in the mountains all along the Blue Ridge, not specifically Barren Hollow. With all the tourists, the hikers, geez, I'm betting some of them never show up in any record because they hike in and out, just passing through on their way from somewhere to somewhere else. Often without family, or with family 6 states away who have no idea where they've been for years. Unless something happens to cause a disturbance, none of the locals would even notice. New faces just passing through is a rule around here, not the exception. A perfect hunting ground, Maggie said. The thought had occurred. I haven't narrowed down the area, but a quick check showed me there are more than 80 people currently listed as officially missing in North Carolina, and those are just the ones on the record. Goodness knows how many have really disappeared without a trace, men, women, and children. But the only thing I found local was a bit on a girl who went missing last summer. Big news, major search and rescue that went on for days, and then her boyfriend, who had reported her missing, seems to have rather solemnly admitted she probably hiked out of the mountains and hitched a ride back home after they fought. The chief of police followed up, and it turns out that's what happened. Case closed. So, no killer. Well, None that I've been able to find any evidence of, but we both know spirits don't show up just to yank somebody's chain. Pardon the pun. You're on vacation, Jesse. Hunting a killer wasn't part of the plan. Tell me about it. After a moment, Maggie said, I'll do some checking on this end and get back to you if I find anything. In the meantime, why don't you spend some family time like you planned? Unless and until another spirit shows up. The only investigating you should be doing is trying to figure out or remember why you ran away when you were 17. That's all for now. Yeah, Jesse said, that's all. Chapter 3, Haven, June 28. Nathan Navarro walked into Command Central with a cup of coffee in hand, yawning. Christ, I feel like I've been asleep for a week, he told Maggie. Nearly 24 hours. But after that last case, you were overdue. Have you eaten? Navarro couldn't help but smile inwardly. She was his employer, and he respected her more than just about anyone else in his life, but it never failed to amuse him that Maggie just naturally mothered everyone around her. She looked at him out of serene golden eyes and a sweet face surrounded by an unruly cloud of reddish hair. Nothing about her appearance offering any indication of the very sharp and oddly calculating mind capable of juggling many operatives and usually several assignments at any given time, and of making some extraordinarily tough-minded decisions. I'm not mothering, Maggie said, just testing the readiness of one of my operatives for a new assignment. Stop reading me. She smiled. Your emotions are easy to pick up on, pal. I don't even have to try. Which sort of fascinates me because you're very, very good at masking them visibly and maintaining an unemotional facade. One of my many strengths. He changed the subject. I'm ready for another assignment. Put me to work. By rights, you should have a week off at least. I don't want a week off. I want to work. She studied him for a moment, seeing a big man with obvious physical strength and an unmistakably military stance, and wondered fleetingly if Bishop was right and Navarro would eventually end up in the SCU. There was nothing to disqualify him, after all, except for his reluctance to too quickly re-up with the U.S. government again after years of naval intelligence. Well, that plus the fact that he was still dealing with the traumatic event that had awakened his latent psychic abilities, and learning to deal with the abilities themselves, at least one of which was most certainly emotionally unsettling, and possibly emotionally damaging. Maggie wasn't sure about that yet. Put me to work, he repeated. What have we got? Bit of a mystery. She caught him up quickly and concisely with Jesse's trip home, the reasons for it, and the spirit she'd encountered warning of a killer hunting that small, isolated town. Navarro frowned. I've never worked with Jessie. Is she a strong medium? Erratic. Same with her telepathy, though that's tested as definitely a lesser ability. But you believe she saw a spirit? Oh, yes. Jessie has a singular lack of imagination in many ways. It's helpful in some cases and a disadvantage in others. But one thing you can be sure of is that if she says she saw a spirit, then she saw a spirit. So I'll be looking for the remains of that victim, and possibly a few more. That's the idea. If there's a killer operating there, he has a wilderness in which to dispose of his victims once he's done with them. And there are plenty of isolated homes and other places where he could hold them, torture them, use them however he does to satisfy whatever his particular twisted needs are. Her voice, always gentle, made the matter-of-fact words sound more chilling. Do we know that's what he's doing? As soon as Jessie reported in, I knew, because somewhere deep down inside, unconsciously, Jessie knows too. I don't know how or why, but she knows. Maybe picking up on the negative energy of months or even years of murders. Maybe she's capable of that. Have you told Bishop about this? Navarro asked. I have. Just talked to him before you walked in. For now, all we have is the word of a spirit that something's been happening there. No evidence. Not only have the local police not asked for outside law enforcement help, they clearly have no awareness that anything unusual might be happening there. The FBI can't show up and launch an investigation without being asked unless they have evidence a federal crime has been committed or the crimes have crossed state lines. So far, no evidence. So it's Haven. I look until I find something to convince the locals they have a problem serious enough to call in the feds, or else find something that makes it clear we have a federal crime on our hands. Exactly. Will I be working with Jessie? Maggie didn't hesitate. No, Jessie needs to concentrate on what she went there to do, find out about and remember the trauma in her past. Unless and until either you or she finds a connection between that and this possible killer, I want you working separately. You've never met, right? Never, oddly enough. Every time I've come back to base, she's been off on assignment. Not so unusual, Maggie told him. We have dozens of agents based in other states now. Since you live in Chicago, you're only here briefly. Just like many of our other operatives. Nathan, are you sure you want to go straight into another assignment? I'm sure. Maggie studied him a moment longer, then nodded. Okay, I've emailed what info I've got to your tablet. Also the dossier on who you'll be in Barren Hollow. That's the name of the town? Odd. Odder still, it used to be Barren Hollow. She spelled it. B-A-R-R-E-N. Apparently someone along the way decided that was redundant. Or just plain unsettling. I'm guessing the place has a history. Oh, yeah. I've also emailed you what background I have. You'll have to dig for the rest yourself. On the way, or once you're there. Copy that. So who am I this time? You'll be using your real name, so that's a plus, unless Jessie happens to recognize it. And if she does, play it by ear. Confide in her if you see the need, but I'm betting she'll be preoccupied with her own concerns. If she doesn't ask any questions or you two don't cross paths, keep your investigation separate until you have something worth sharing. Copy that, he said again. This time around you're a writer. Go start reading up on the file in case you have questions. The jet's standing by. Wheels up in 3 hours. That should put you in Barren Hollow late this afternoon, and you're booked into Rayburn House for the next 2 weeks. 2 summer weeks in the southern mountains looking for a killer. Just my idea of a good time. He lifted his coffee cup in a rather mocking salute, then left the room. Almost immediately, Maggie picked up one of the office phones and hit a speed dial number. Bishop. Nathan will be on his way shortly, Maggie said without preamble. Listen, are you sure this is the way to go? Sending him in there without telling him about Emma Rayburn? I'm sure. And I don't suppose it'll do me any good to ask why. Some things have to happen just the way they happen. Noah Bishop, an exceptionally powerful telepath and seer, possessed a normally cool and virtually always calm voice that gave away nothing he didn't want it to. So, as usual, he gave away nothing, especially when reciting what had become the SCU mantra. Nathan's going to be pissed when he finds out, she said. No, I think not, Bishop replied. In fact, I think that by the time he finds out about Emma, Navarro is going to have far too much on his mind to worry about. Trifles? Trifles? Bishop, one of these days, either one of your people or one of mine is going to stumble over one trifle too many and come after you with blood in their eye. Better watch your back. Oh, I do, Bishop said. I always do. Seriously? What's with us and the weather? Special Agent Tony Hart of the FBI Special Crimes Unit stood at the window, frowning as he stared out at the heavy rain. No matter where we land, the weather invariably begins to suck. Are we carrying around our own dark cloud? Do you really want me to answer that? Bishop asked absently. He was half sitting on one end of a long conference table as he studied crime scene photos, suspect photos, timelines, and other notes on an evidence board in front of him. It's been raining for 3 days straight, boss. It's Seattle, Tony. It rains here. A lot. Tony sighed and moved away from the window. Yeah. At least it's just rain now and not a storm. I hardly slept a wink last night. The storms just kept rolling through, hour after hour. I know. Now, for the first time, Tony reminded himself that if he, only a second-degree telepath and so relatively weak in terms of sensitivity, had been disturbed to the point of wakefulness by the energy of this storm, Then Bishop, whose abilities were redefining the limits of power even within the SCU, must have been driven nearly mad by it. Then again, he was Bishop, so probably not. Tony said, well, it makes things difficult. The rain. If there was any evidence at that murder scene, it's been washed away, same as with the first two. He frowned as he sat down at the conference table near his unit chief. Do you think that was deliberate, waiting for the weather to help him? I think there's very little about this killer that isn't deliberate, Bishop responded. It's gotta make it harder for him to hunt, Tony said. Maybe somewhere else, but in Seattle, when people stayed inside to avoid the rain, they never go anywhere. He's chosen spots that aren't well traveled but do serve as handy shortcuts for people who live and work downtown. Pedestrian shortcuts. Good point. I guess that's why they pay you the big bucks. Bishop turned slightly to look at his agent. Something on your mind, Tony? You don't already know? Tony frowned and said, oh, you're shielding. Bishop didn't change expression. His face remote in a way that might have made someone who didn't know him uneasy. Miranda is working that serial case outside Chicago. Tony did know his boss and nodded in understanding. Then you two are taking the threat against her task force seriously. Yes. And you believe the serial they're after is psychic? Bishop nodded. So he and his wife had closed down the link between them as much as possible. The two of them shielding their abilities both for their own protection and to safeguard what information both knew about their investigations. Tony wondered, not for the first time, what really would happen if one of them was. He shut even the wondering down, remembering instead what had happened only a few months previously on a painfully bright street in a terrorized small town. Miranda lying there bleeding, while her husband, ashen-faced, held onto her hand and to the telepathic link between them with all the considerable strength at his command. Psychic connections could be lifelines. They could also be very, very dangerous. Tony, what is it? Pushing that horrible memory aside, Tony said, what's going on with Haven? What do you mean? I mean, all the emails and phone calls and other communication between Haven and the SCU. Between you and Maggie. I know it's normal, boss, what's usual, and I know what's unusual. This is unusual. What's going on? Bishop didn't question his agent's knowledge of communications that were, to say the least, sensitive. Within the SCU, it was commonly recognized, however rarely, that there were few, if any, secrets inside a unit made up of psychics. Instead, he merely explained the situation with Jessie, her homecoming, and what she had seen there. So we've got another killer, and we got checking it out. There's no evidence of a crime, Tony. Jessie saw a spirit. No name. No good description. No idea when the woman died. Even the most open-minded of small-town police officials are going to have a hard time justifying an investigation into something like that. But we're not doing anything. It wasn't a question. Tony knew his boss very well. Bishop's shoulders lifted and fell in a faint shrug. Haven doesn't have to wait for an invitation. So, Maggie, Sunny, and Nathan Navarro with a solid cover story. With a frown, Tony said, no, that's a name I know. He's a bit like Lucas is a name. Lucas Jordan, another SCU team member, specialized in locating missing persons, and Haven operatives tended to quote-unquote mirror SCU agents when it came to their abilities, with a few extras and oddities thrown in, of course. A bit like him, except that Navarro's unique ability is to find the dead. But he isn't a medium. No, not as we define mediums. He doesn't see the dead, but he's able to locate their remains. He says he feels pulled in the right direction, starts with a map or a logical place to search, and just follows his instincts. His secondary ability is clairvoyance, also useful, but nowhere near under his control yet. He came out of naval intelligence with considerable investigative skills as well. Another ex-military operative. Bishop nodded. They do seem to find us. Or vice versa. In any case, military training means additional survival skills that are likely to come in handy. Especially in this case, since Navarro is in a small town surrounded by the closest thing we have to wilderness. Something else that sounds familiar. I know we often work in cities, such as now, but we do seem to end up in nice little towns surrounded by wilderness and inhabited by a human monster, or two, an awful lot more often than chance would dictate. Sure enough. Tony brooded for a few moments while his boss returned to studying the evidence board for their current case. Finally, Tony said if Maggie sent in Navarro, she must be pretty sure whatever Jessie saw is just the beginning. I'd say so. But the beginning of what? New murders or the uncovering of old ones? That, Bishop said, is what Navarro is there to find out. Baron Hollow, I think I want to go to church today. Do you go to church? Jessie asked suddenly at breakfast. Sometimes, not every Sunday. Still the First Baptist? Yeah, like half the town. Good, Jessie said. Want to come along today? Why not? Then let's get ready. If that clock over there is right, preaching starts in about an hour. Emma might not know her sister very well as an adult, but it didn't take sisterly knowledge to look at the closed, almost secretive expression on Jessie's face and know that she was going to church for a good reason, and it had nothing to do with prayer or singing hymns. Emma just wished she knew what that reason was. She was no wiser nearly an hour later, except in her realization that Jessie intended to visibly be at church. Not only was she wearing a dress, which had been rare for her back in the day, she was wearing a red dress, a very red dress. Emma wasn't embarrassed or otherwise bothered by the display, just curious. She was even more curious when Jessie led the way to the front of the church to the quote-unquote family pew and took a seat there, as if she wanted every person in the packed church to know that Jessie Rayburn was back home. And afterward, during the customary socializing out in the church's front yard, Jessie asked Emma to reintroduce her to people she had known or who had known the family when she was a teenager, which meant just about everybody, or at least those who lingered to talk. Emma didn't know what her sister was up to, but she had a strong feeling that she wasn't the only one who viewed Jessie's calm smile and curiously flat eyes with unease. Worse, she thought Jessie knew exactly the effect she was having on those around her, and that it was very deliberate. Jessie, what are you doing? Emma asked as the sisters walked the short distance back to Rayburn House. Without denial, Jessie merely said, stirring the pot. Okay, but what's in the pot? The past, and maybe something that carried over into the present. Am I supposed to understand what you're talking about? No, not yet. For the first time, Jessie's smile held a hint of a real apology. The less you know, the better, at least for now. That sounds foreboding. Emma kept her tone light, but she began to feel seriously alarmed. As they turned onto the walkway to the front door of Rayburn House, Jessie was shaking her head. Don't worry, I'm not sure it's even about me anymore. At least what? Seemingly half to herself, Jessie said, at least maybe I can help stop something that started with me, even if it wasn't my fault, even if I... Never mind, Em. Never mind? Jessie? But Emma never finished the question because her sister's face had closed down again. And if she had learned one thing about this woman her sister had become, it was that she didn't give away anything she intended to keep to herself. She didn't give it away to anyone. Normally, he wouldn't have been on the hunt again so soon. He tended to be satisfied and satiated after enjoying himself with his prey, able to go on about his normal life without the dark urges tormenting him. For weeks, usually even months, sometimes when he needed to stretch it out because of the dearth of prey in the winter. But the last one had escaped before he had finished with her, and that had left him unsatisfied. He had tracked her, of course, and he had found her, and left her as he found her. She was far, far off the trails in the area, and he didn't anticipate anyone else finding her. The scavengers would finish off the remains quickly enough. He considered briefly and then discarded the idea of bringing her back to his garden. She didn't deserve to be there, he decided. She was unworthy of that very precious and beautiful resting place. She deserved what she'd gotten, sprawled out on the hard, bloody ground for animals and maggots to feed off. He had been enraged by her escape, but he had learned long ago to channel his anger into something more constructive. This time it had been repairing and strengthening his trap so that his prey would never escape him again. Now, calm once more but highly conscious of the hunger inside him, he began to hunt. Watching the tourists, the hikers, those transients who passed through his town on a regular basis, noting who was alone or apt to wander away from their group, noting which ones found rooms in town and which preferred to truly rough it in the woods with tents and sleeping bags, looking for vulnerabilities. It was half the fun of the hunt, choosing his next prey. He didn't lurk, but came and went casually, making a point not to spend very much time in any one spot. He talked to those he would be expected to talk to, but otherwise kept himself in the background as much as possible, something he was very good at doing. And watched. A small voice in the back of his mind warned him to wait, to keep an eye on Jessie Rayburn and find out for certain just why she was back here after so many years. But that voice was drowned out by the dark urges driving him. He needed to hunt now. And if, later on, Jessie proved to be a problem he would need to deal with, then, well, he knew how to handle her. Nobody would be surprised, after all, if Jessie ran away from Barren Hollow again. Nobody at all.